No, he's ready.
Oh, you're ready? Okay, well, good morning, everyone. First, we'd like to invite our other panelist, Dan Sheehy. No, it's not a question, it's an order. No. Aquí, the hot seat.
Yeah,
Are you going to share that? Bribe us to skip questions? So, good morning. This morning we have, in addition to our distinguished guest, Dan Sheehy, Russell Rodriguez, PhD, working with ACTA, the Alliance for California Traditional Arts, Alex Chavez, assistant professor at the University of Notre Dame, and myself, Olga Nájera Ramirez from UC Santa Cruz. It's a real pleasure to greet you all this morning. This is a new activity which we hope will continue in subsequent years of our meetings. Last year in our Chicano and Chicana and Folklore Latino, Latinoamericano y Caribeño sections, we decided to launch a new event, and the idea was that we would get to know some of our members. And we immediately jumped on the idea that this would be a wonderful opportunity to showcase one of our most distinguished members, Daniel Sheehy. So I have to say that one of the things is that we decided to create a PowerPoint to guide us through the discussion, and we're going to share with you some questions, images, sounds, and video clips to entice Dan to talk about our aspects of his career. And I have to say that the PowerPoint is supposed to help us structure and keep things in order, and I'll tell you why right here.
I tell you, it's
This is what happened last.
Sure, microphones in your hand without, at least for me, without going. Ay, qué linda, qué chula es la fiesta de mi rancho.
So we wanted to make sure that wasn't going to happen again this year. We want him to actually answer questions. Not until we tell him to, no. So we're going to uncover the man, the legend, the myth, the legendary folklorist. And we start with, where did this white charro come from?
Wait, let him see it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, you could. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. I'm sorry, I forgot you weren't seeing this.
I've seen that image before.
You don't know me, but you don't like me. You say you care less how I feel. How many of you that sit and judge me ever walk the streets of Bakersfield? How many of you that sit and judge me ever walk the streets of Bakersfield?
So that question is for all of you. Before you sit and judge Dan Sheehy, we want you to walk the streets of Bakersfield. We're going to frame this session by having each of the panelists here briefly mention how they met Dan.
I'm going to start.
Russell.
Yeah, I'm going to start. Actually, this photo is probably the first image when I actually saw Dan Sheehy. This is a photo in San Jose, right? Was it one of the Lupeño shows? Yeah. So I was probably about 9 years old, and they were coming, Mariachi Platlan was coming up to San Jose to play the concerts with Los Lupeños de San Jose. And my older sister was dancing with the group, but during the Christmas show, they would have all the children that were in Los Mestizos, the group my mother had, come and fill in the crowd and dance the last number. And I was just standing there looking at these two trumpet players, these tall, huge, white trompeteros that were incredible, because I think I was taking trumpet at the time. And it was Jim Coding, no? Jim Coding. Yeah. And these guys were incredibly impressive. You know, they were just amazing to watch, and I knew something was weird about it.
And how old were you?
And I guess I was 9, but it was through that kind of connection with Los Lupeños and Mariachi Culatlan. I mean, by the time I was 10 or 11, I already knew. I've heard of what ethnomusicology was. I was hearing about UCLA. I was hearing about actually Mexican folk music as a study in college. You know, I wasn't college, by no means was I college bound. You know, at this, you know, coming from East San Jose, we didn't have a pathway into college, but this was incredibly influential in my life, and to see people like Dan Sheehy, Mark Vogelquist, Larry Saunders, Steve Hoffman, Jim, these guys they just had an incredible impact on it. But Dan Sheehy was the one I continuously had contact with, and has become an incredible mentor. I don't even know when we actually talked for the first time, though.
I don't either.
It might have been Veracruz, you know.
Yeah. So my experience is distinct from Russell's, and it's a lot more recent. So I actually, the first time how I came to know Dan was through his scholarship. So, you know, at the kind of beginning stages of my research on Huapango Ribeño, so mining through literature on son mexicano. And I came across that dissertation, the Son Jarocho dissertation of 1979, which was it's really kind of a landmark, right, piece of scholarship, and something that I dug into, and you know, parts of his sort of other scholarship as well. But it was actually through then, a few years later, through Russell and Olga, that I was introduced to Dan under different circumstances through Russell trying to make a connection with the Fellows program there at DC, which I couldn't go. I was already in the field. And then with Olga, actually here at the folklore meetings. And we sort of continued to reconnect. And, you know, beyond our friendship, actually entering into more recently a working relationship. And it's kind of a final point in terms of, you know, understanding, you know, sort of Dan as a scholar as well, is that, so we just recently worked on a recording of Huapango Ribeño for Smithsonian Folkways, which is an amazing experience, right? So from being asked to be a lead consultant and co-produce a record, but traveling with Dan, right, to Guanajuato and Querétaro to find some musicians, and then going back to actually make the record, right, just this past August that we finished that project, which was amazing, an amazing experience, and kind of in that regard, you know, I you know, respect Dan as a scholar, but also I think, and at least for me more importantly too, as over these past few years as a mentor, right? And I think that for me is, you know, he is incredibly interested in seeing, and this is from conversations with people throughout our association and others, that very interested in seeing young scholars and folklorists succeed, and will do everything that he can, right, to help you in that endeavor, right? So I really value Dan's mentorship, and I think that is equally a huge part of his legacy, right? So.
Can I say something?
Yes, you may.
Well, first of all, I'm extremely honored to be sitting at the table up here with these folks and with you all there. I have to say, this is a first for me. A. B, I already said it, I'm honored. And 3, I have to say, I'm just a little bit intimidated because these are some of the 3 smartest people I've ever hung around with. Alex, I just recently read his article in Latin American Music Review, and I had to read each page like 5 times because there was so much there, both in the positioning of concepts and the vocabulary and the whole thing. I was just like, it's one of those you know, jaw-dropping scholarly experiences. And Russ, actually, I don't know if we talked or didn't talk way back then, but you were clearly, Russell Rodriguez was clearly a leader, especially for his years in this whole ambiance, multi-generational, traditions of Mexico being interpreted there. And I've just actually been privileged to know you all, and not to mention be able to work with you. And just one clarification: the project isn't finished until Alex finishes the notes.
Yeah.
Just a little message there, but he knows that. He knows that. And then La Profe here, I'm almost afraid of what she's going to say. So, oh, okay, all right, good. That's it for the moment.
So I do want to say how I got to know Dan. And I think it's really important that I started my career in folklore more through my participation in folklorico dance. And folklorico dance was not very well respected in academia, and probably to this day isn't much. But I met Dan a long, long time ago through the Asociación Nacional de Grupos Folclóricos. This is a national organization, and we convened in different sites throughout the United States. And in the early years, there used to be music workshops, and it was open to everybody. So we do our dance workshops, and at night, I attended one of the music workshops, and I'm pretty sure it was Mark Vogelkist who was leading the session, but somehow I remember meeting Dan there. Very briefly, I'm not a musician, so I was hanging out and singing, trying to sing, and that's how I met Dan. I don't remember us talking. All I know is that years later, another 10 or 12 years later, in 1983, I attended the first meeting for myself at the AFS meeting in Nashville. I didn't know a soul. I looked around at this convention center. It was just tons of people, and I felt very intimidated, so I was just hanging out in the lobby, and I got to look across the lobby, and I see Dan Sheehy. I knew who he was. I didn't think he knew who I was, but he immediately stretched his arms out like this, like we were old friends. It was the warmest feeling. I mean, talk about feeling welcome into an association. I was so touched. I mean, in my mind, I was like running, you know, like those commercials to meet him. And I hugged him, and I felt so welcome. And ever since then, we really did establish an ongoing relationship, and he invited me to participate as a grants reviewer for the NEA and a site evaluator, which was more fun than it was work. And through the years, we just really bonded. But he was a wonderful example of how you could actually bridge and really validate my interest in folklorico and in folk traditions. So it was just incredible, and I'm very grateful to him, and I do consider him one of my mentors.
Just to show how different people have different perspectives on things, were you in Alamosa?
I'm not sure.
At
Yes.
the Asociación, yeah. That one of my most vivid memories, other than, of course, associating with Olga there, that was my very first toga party. Mariachi Los Gallitos from Houston. Yeah, but they were in Alamosa at that ANJEF thing, and they invited me to their, they were all family except for one person, like 8 of them. They said, come over, we're gonna have a little thing in our rooms, and everybody's dressed in sheets, and they say, okay, here's the sheets for you. So, anyway, there was great camaraderie, as Olga was suggesting there, as well as lots of substance, both in the academic settings and also in the dance promotion setting. So,
Okay, so we're going to continue. This was Russell's title, Music and the Mocoso. So Russell, go ahead.
So we know that Dan's from Bakersfield, and we just know him as a musician. But I just wanted to ask, what was it that, how did you start as music? Was there a mentor? Was somebody, what prompted you towards music?
2 things. One was my mother, who she was busy as a mom and didn't have much chance to practice music, but she'd sing in the Hallelujah chorus stuff every Christmas and things. She was a bass player, but there was something there. And the other, to be totally frank, is my next door neighbor and best friend decided to take up trumpet in the 5th grade, and I wanted to hang out with him. So that's how I picked up trumpet. Are we going to talk about those images there at some point?
Yes, let's talk about it.
You want me to say something? Yes. Okay. on the left, that's either 7th or 8th grade. It was either, no, it had to be 7th because it was Golden State Junior High School, as they were called then. A new high school was built called Curran, so I switched over there to that, and it turned out years later that Curran Junior High School was one of the middle schools in California that had a strong mariachi program taught by Richard Rodriguez, who went to school with me at UCLA and was in the band with me. And so there were great, kind of closing the loop kinds of experiences to go back to that little phase of my life. Though, as you can see, I didn't have a traje de charro on.
Close.
You can look over on the right, though. I look at that. I kind of, that's sort of like a time capsule there. I went to South High School in Bakersfield, and the mascot of the high school was a Confederate colonel. And after, I guess I was a junior, and I was, I loved, all the camaraderie and all the fun stuff with the music and the band and everything. I became the drum major, went off to drum major camp. The person to your left of me is my cousin, Sandy, who, there was a 150-piece drill team, all with those sort of Confederate kind of array on, and everyone with the stars and bars of the people of all backgrounds, Mexican, African American, Anglo-Asian, everything, and at the time, we just lived in that sort of a hermeneutically sealed world. But looking back at it later, they don't use the Confederate flags anymore at that high school. But that was what I was talking about last night at this other talk. That was sort of the path I was on. Jumping off from there, went to UCLA to study to be a high school band director. That was my lifelong sort of intention for those couple of years. In any case, so.
That's a great segue. Actually.
Yes, we didn't practice. So the question here is, why did you select UCLA to do your studies?
That's a really good question. Probably because it was the closest big university. Probably because I got into it, and definitely because I wanted to get out of Bakersfield. Nothing against Bakersfield. It's a sort of a what does it call you when you? It's sort of a badge of honor that I survived Bakersfield. And so, but UCLA was, it's a big name. That's 100 miles away, and so it was and I had friends who were going there basically. So I had no notion of the existence of ethnomusicology or folklore or any of that at the time. It was all, being a band director. And actually, since I was the drum major, I have this vivid memories of going down for competitions in the greater LA area. And I remember, it's probably a little bit reversed these days, but we'd go down from the Central Valley before all the pesticides and all the fertilizer and all the dust and all the air contamination down there. And I remember I couldn't take like one step without coughing because the smog was so incredibly thick and bad and smoky. And I was the drum major. And you have to, you do these things like you're back behind the goal, and all the band is out there, right? And the drill team all around you, like 225 people. And there's a path in the middle, and you have this big baton you're supposed to go. Can we do it again?
Do it again. Who got it? Did anybody get it?
Okay, you ready?
No, they got it. They got it on there.
Recording.
And of course, I went to a band camp down there to study that sort of thing. But I tell you, with the smog in Claremont, which is where that one year I'm remembering was, it was rugged, but at least it left some sort of memory in my mind about Southern California. So I ended up there with my Honda 50 when I was a student at UCLA, and I remember these images of just the tears just going back both sides of my face as I was riding my little motorcycle there, and the analysis of the different configurations of smog, the different chemicals in smog, and different parts of Los Angeles had different ingredients to their smog, and sulfur was very high in the Westwood UCL area, so that basically it was turning into sulfuric acid in my eyes. But that's a digression. So go ahead.
Yeah, I think we wanted to ask in terms of like being at UCLA and like performance practice was a kind of a signature aspect of that program. It was very distinct from a lot of other places that were doing ethno at the time. So if you can talk about that experience, what was that like and what did that mean in terms of being an ethno there at UCLA and having to,
Well, since we're being, I suppose the idea is to be frank here. It was a convenient excuse to be able to play different music.
That's great, yeah.
But it was real. On the left is a version of after I'd studied African Ashanti drumming and played in the rhythm and blues band, which I don't think there's any existing photo of. Too bad. It was the Thunder Brothers. It was one of the greatest moments of my eras, 2 years of my life, playing Friday nights, Saturday nights, and Sundays, and in an all African American, basically neighborhood and clubs, slightly seedy, called Jeffties. I was like, this is like, oh my God, how this is. I felt so privileged to be there and immersed in this really tight community that was so connected to the music. It was so exciting. And then I discovered jarocho music in the basement of the music building, and 3 people at the time were playing there. One was the harpist there, Ed Lalo Lindgren. He was a career ESL teacher at San Fernando High School before he retired. And in that version of the group, there was also the same Jim Ketting that Russell mentioned, and Susilo Harjo, who was an artist in residence teaching Javanese gamelan at UCLA. And it was just, the first thing that hit me was the sound of the music and how similar it was to structurally as African music, and I thought, wow, this is really cool. And then the interesting people playing it, where it was another dimension of it. And I was just, and then every Saturday morning, I don't know if any of you know who Timothy Harding is. He was a leftist professor at Cal State, LA, who I found out when I came to Folkways, recorded Sones de Mexico album, I think published in the early 50s, I don't remember the year for sure. But he was into leftist labor politics in Mexico and Brazil and elsewhere, I'm sure. I remember visiting him after I got into performing the music, and he had it had to be an FBI agent parked permanently outside of his house there. He said yes it was, and he talks to him every once in a while, but they had their eye on him. In any case, he'd come over on every Saturday morning when he dropped his daughters, Libby and Cindy, who then created a still ongoing jarocho group today in Los Angeles. And while they took classes in whatever, we would play Sony's jarochos at my place about 5 blocks away. And so I got really immersed in that music. This is the fellow on the right is a Cuban, Jose Fajet. He passed away several years ago. Tragically, it's so sad, of AIDS. And he was one of the members of Conjunto Trio Jarocho Angelino. And right there is at Lowry's Restaurant in downtown Los Angeles, just off of Figueroa, kind of back over the hill from the downtown. And we played there every week. And we alternated with a man who would be a lifelong friend of mine, and named El Capiro de Jalisco Número Uno, Francisco Castro. That's his own self-imposed apodo there. A guitarrón player who was in Mariachi Uclatlan when we went professional. And I have some nice photos of him other places. On the right is, I can't see who's there. There are a couple of photos. There, I see, okay. That is Mariachi Uclatlan in approximately 1969. On the left is James Vogelquist, who is now a chair of 2 departments at University of North Carolina in Boone, and he chaired other departments in Pocatello and Colorado Springs. His father was the chair of Spanish and Portuguese at UCLA. He was a very talented violinist and singer. Jesus Sanchez was the sort of the linchpin of the mariachi education in the greater LA area. He taught over on Terrace, the junior high school in East Los Angeles, that he taught at there, and he taught at Cal State LA. And I remember meeting him. He was a man of such enormous dignity. He always had a great posture there, and his violin he just read dignity through and through. And he had played salon music in the 1920s, and he's from Jalisco, Zacoalco, Jalisco. And he then went on to Mexico City and played with Mariachi Mexico de Pepe Villa. He was like a top-notch violinist. And my predecessors in the ethnomusicology at UCLA discovered him picking strawberries in the fields around Oxnard, and heard that he was playing music on the weekends, and they recruited him to teach there at UCLA. Next to him is the late Victor Romero, who was a social work student and filmmaker. Next to him was a former professor at Santa Cruz, David Kilpatrick, who he didn't get tenure, he went on to teach high school, mariachi in high school. Next to them is Zeta Vihuela. That's Jose Perez, who's also from Jalisco, starts with a Z, blanking on it. And on the right is a social worker named Bob Dixon. And at a certain point in my life, I didn't have a place to live. And I stayed with him for I don't know how many months, several months, sort of as a way station. And I don't know if this is proper for these things, but maybe it is today with the laws changing and everything. He would start every morning smoking a joint, and then he'd get in his classic Volvo and happily drive off to work and as a social worker, and take another toke at lunch, and then come back home, and it was and and I remember him telling me one time, he says, these people who say marijuana is addictive, they're just really full of it. He said, they don't know what they're talking about. He said, I've smoked marijuana every day for 13 years, and I'm not addicted to it. Anyway, so that's the story on that. That's at the Plaza, the Calle Olvera, the Placita there in downtown Los Angeles. And that's when we were, still basically a student group, where we started to depart from the university environment to play parties and things. Jose Perez. That's
Yes, this is gorgeous.
Ay, cuánto me gusta el gusto y toda la parranda y todo se me va a embeber. ¿Qué haré para enamorar a esa pérfida mujer? Bello es amar a una mujer que sepa amar, porque el amor es traicionero, soy parrandero, ¿para qué le de negar?
So the question is, basically, we knew that you would wander off.
We knew what?
We knew you were wandering off.
Oh, yes.
But
I do that in conversations, too. And on panels like this.
but who's your crew? Who were you wandering off with? And, where were you going? Of course, we have the picture of La Fonda. We assume.
That's 2501 Wilshire Boulevard, La Fonda. La Fonda de los Camperos is actually the official name of it. I started playing mariachi music in 1968 at the invitation of, I think I said that already, right? When our band broke up and the guitarist was recruited by War, Howard Scott, and went off to. I said that last night. That's right. Yeah, you weren't all there. I wasn't all there either. Wrote the Cisco Kid and all this thing. Long story there. Anyway, and so Jim Keddy, a fellow graduate student, who now passed away, had a heart attack at the SEM conference in LA a number of years back. A great soul from Wisconsin said, hey, we need a trumpet player in the mariachi group. And he knew me from the Jarocho stuff. He says, come join. So I said, okay, great, let's go do it. And '69 is when Naticano and Mariachi Los Camperos opened La Fonda de los Camperos on Wilshire Boulevard, downtown Los Angeles, and later on, I mean, this is like, deja vu all over and all over and all over again in terms of some of the recordings we've done and my work at the NEA too. I kept reconnecting with Naticano, and I remember we would go. Most of those people in that previous photo there, this was like the temple of the gods and the pantheon of mariachi musicians and he had it set up as a stage, so it's almost really like a temple. You're kind of looking up at the musicians like that, and there was something far beyond emulation there. It was just like the impossibility of ever achieving anything like what they were doing. They played things like Hello Dolly as well as sones like El Jabalí and things like that. And I remember one time we went back, I guess they figured out, or somebody told them that we were the UCLA student group, and we went there after some performance, and people have been drinking and eating and drinking and drinking and eating and drinking, and there was a break, and they said, "Hey, you guys, why don't you come up and play a couple tunes on stage, so we can hear what you sound like during their break." And we got up there and had this vivid image of, other than being plastered, of Jimmy Vogelquist, now Dr. Vogelquist, getting his bow caught in the strings and his violin on the stage there, and his Camperos go flying up in the air. it's like, oh my God, it could not have been worse. But they were very polite and got us off after about a song and a half. And but this La Fonda became like an historical, with enormous impact. Naticano, there's a story in one of the album notes that we published, maybe in Llegaron los Camperos, where Nati was on tour with Camperos, accompanying Miguel Aceves Mejia in Lubbock, Texas, and he went to, they played a show. It was an early matinee thing, and they went to dinner. He and his friend Clemente was the guitarrón player, and they walked in the restaurant, and they said, "Can we sit down?" And the guy sort of looked at him and kind of ignored him a little bit, and they said, "Excuse me, we'd like to eat here." And anyway, they went back and forth, and the maitre d' came, and the way Nati told the story, he said, maitre d' finally said, out of frustration of not getting the message across, he said, "Look, buddy, we don't serve Mexicans here." And Nati was like, he says, "Oh my God," he said, "this used to be part of Mexico, and here we are, and people are talking to us like this." And he said, he told me this story many times, that he went home that night, in the hotel there, and shared a room with Clemente. He said, "Someday I am going to create a place where people de todos colores y todos sabores will come and hear really great mariachi music." And that turned into La Fonda de los Camperos. So there was definitely a very deep and profound backstory there, and that was combined with the fact that he grew up, playing with his uncle and sometimes grandfather and his father in bars in Guadalajara, and mariachis were really looked down on. There's this famous quote of his that says that there was a sign on the cantinas, very normal thing of saying, "No uniformados, mujeres, moleros, perros, or mariachis allowed." So no people in uniform, beggars, women, meaning women of the night, I guess, and dogs or mariachis allowed. And so there was this whole class thing that shaped his entire trajectory for the rest of his career. He had two dimensions, kind of like what I talked about me last night, There was the musical dimension, really wanting to play the best music possible. Then there was the social dimension, wanting to change the world in social terms, to be more inclusive, and in his case, to respect mariachi music. And there's a new CD coming out with more interview material, and this is exactly what Nati felt good about over the years of having achieved a new social frame around mariachi music in the United States and in Mexico, and being very accepted on concert stages in Lincoln Center, Kennedy Center, LA Music Center, the Zellerbach, other places. So anyway, there's a pretty big story that goes along with that building right there.
Well, on that note, in terms of the student group and everybody that you were playing with, and kind of to Russell's point earlier, like how were you all received, right? I mean, you see these pictures, right, and then sort of you clearly had an impact on Russell, right? And apart from I guess his disastrous performance that one evening, right?
That wasn't me that got my violin caught on the on the bow.
Yeah, but I mean, we were curious.
How were we received? How was I received? Well. In general, we were a novelty for sure, and I'm sure there were impressions that people wouldn't tell us, just because they had to do with race, it had to do with, like any sort of. I'm sure the attitudes ranged from being extremely welcoming to being hostile, frankly, to have a white person or people playing mariachi, because we were in it was the '60s. Still, and there was the farm workers movement. There was the Brown Beret events, and I remember showing up at a couple events with this other group next to us that we would alternate. It was a group called Los Lobos del Este de Los Angeles, later called Los Lobos, and they were a scruffy bunch, kind of like we had our suits, but we were a little scruffy too, actually. Hippies, probably better word, hippie looking anyway. And the only really negative thing that ever has stuck with me over, I don't know how many years that was, 7 years, I guess, playing with the Uclatlan, was playing in the Oxnard Convention Center for a Cinco de Mayo related event. And the folklóricos were there, and the audience, the local audience was, almost all Mexican audience. And then this gangly bunch of the students walked on stage in the mariachi, and there were boos that came from the audience, and that was something. That was a learning moment, a teaching moment, which was it was ultimately a positive, edifying sort of thing. But it was I think frankly that because when we went professional, like in 1970, 71, and playing. We played like 35 hours a week, 30 to 35 hours a week, every week, in addition to doing whatever else we did. And I think it made people kind of think. A lot of people thought about mariachi music maybe in a different way, putting it in a different frame. And Uclatlan was the name that I think it was Mark Fogelquist who came up with that name. And Tlan, of course, means land of in Nahuatl. And UCLA is UCLA, so it was it was easy to pick up on the fact that there was a UCLA dimension to this. But, and it was, however, so in the group though, there's its own dynamics. I remember I played for a while. One of our trumpet players left and recruited a trumpet player. Half the group was like hardcore mariacheros, from wherever, Jalisco or Zacatecas, Aguascalientes, or whatever. I'm talking about hardcore mariacheros. And this Pedro Pina, he was new to the group, and my Spanish wasn't anywhere near being perfect or fluent. Well, maybe sort of fluent, but anyway. Two things. One, Pedro was very short and very round, and I was taller and very thin. And people started calling us El Número 10. And when they'd see us next to each other, because there's a 1 and a 0, His name was Pedro Pina, which sort of added to that image, Peter Pineapple. He was really good, but I remember once somebody substituted for him, and the guy looks at me because he was tired, and he says, "Oye, échame liebra." And I said, "What?" And then he saw me look at him and say, "What?" And he looked at me like, this big question mark. He says, "Who are you?" Because I didn't pick up on the slang, the mariachi slang stuff going on there. So, anyway, there was definitely an interesting social dimension in all this, both within the group and outside of the group. Oh, hey, did you have the other picture there? That was the one right before. Yeah, that's the San Gabriel Mission there. That has Mark on the left. And then the right, that's when we got some heavy-duty gig for somebody. And so they sent us to a professional studio to have our pictures taken. The guy on the right is Jose Ramos. The guy on the left, by the way, is El Copiro de Jalisco número uno, the guitarrón player. Jose Ramos gave me probably my main apodo because he was from Aguascalientes, and he is not exactly a common name, in Mexico. And so he kept saying, she, this, and because I was this white guy, he ended up calling me Mr. Chicles. And chicles, of course, the little chiclets, in those days, as soon as you cross the border, at least in Tijuana, because I live in California, you're accosted by like 5 or 6 little kids with little chiclet packages, chicles a un peso. And so he converted me to Mr. Chicles, yeah, and that became one of my 3 apodos, the other being El Camarón, and the other being El Tomate, which, because my face would always turn red when I play trumpet, basically. And when I speak on panels, it turns red, too. so anyway, that was the other thing.
Okay, so we want to ask, you kind of addressed this earlier a little bit, but the why jarocho music, right, for research. Yeah, why? Yeah.
The why?
Yeah, why?
Oh, why? There it says right there, why? Because.
Okay, all right. Next slide.
Well, let me tell you, I was working in around the archives and all that at the musicology, and I came very close not to going to Veracruz because of recording, in the Smithsonian Folkways tradition, there's all this talk about Folkways conversions. And there was a recording of music from around Lake Titicaca in Peru, the lakes right there, the neighbors with Bolivia, I guess, too. And I almost, because of that recording, went off there to do my PhD dissertation, but I was so ensconced in Música Jarocha at that time. And the photo on the right, the man on the top left, his son, Jose Gutierrez, alias El Chayote, was in Los Angeles, and he was part of my path into the deeper son jarocho, beyond the sounds, into the culture. And I was just fascinated because he would tell me all these stories of ranch life, and just like what we in Guanajuato went to a party, an old abandoned kind of hacienda site, and with 175 family members there, hiring with the group that we recorded with Alex there. The same was true on La Costa de la Palma, right next to Alvarado, bordering the lagoon. And I'd hear all these stories. So my main contact that got me into the local scene there was Isidoro Gutierrez, top on the left there, who was a musician, instrument maker. And the guy on the bottom right was related to him, Daniel Ramos, related by marriage. And so, I don't know, it was just such a natural. I wrote my embarrassing master's thesis on the son jarocho. My advisor was really into technology and the Seeger melograph, and so he sort of got me into writing a dissertation on speech deviations as one determinant of style in the son jarocho of Veracruz, Mexico. Because analyzing the melody and with electronics and things like that, there's a little history in there. That's what I fondly look back on. The rest of it, I'm just kind of embarrassed about. Anyway, so I got this Fulbright. Drove my car down there to stayed overnight while I found a place to live in Villa del Mar Hotel. I got there after hours, and the kitchen was closed, and I said, I'm so hungry, please. They said, well, we have some chicken soup. And I said, I'll take it, chicken soup, right? So within about 12 hours of having that chicken soup, I was diagnosed with Salmonella typhosa, which is really bad. Everyone gets Salmonella typhosa. it's like fluids emanating from every part of your body. I won't be specific. And they said, don't go to the hospital, whatever you do. And so anyway, I got fixed up. I ended up with a little room above Don Pancho's house in Boca del Rio, south of the city of Veracruz, about 4 blocks from the image on the left, which I know when was taken because somebody, I think Russell was there, and somebody with Los Lupeños was going out. This is Boca del Rio, exactly. But this would be 78. Yeah, it was 78. Because I had my trumpet with me every Sunday afternoon. I'd play in the danzonera, in the El Casino de Boca del Rio, which was basically the other guys in the group were ferrocarrileros, the railroad guys come down from Tierra Blanca on Sundays when they weren't working. We played danzones, Cuban type danzones, because that was big and still is in Veracruz. And so I had my trumpet with me. By the way, there was this great danzon. We read music and all. It was, and the place was, the main clientele were basically rancheros from outside and prostitutes. That was who was there, and I remember this one danzón entitled Japón tu padre y China tu madre. I was thinking, how can you get a more Mexican title for a danzón than this? That was a really cool title. Somebody else can explain it to anybody who has questions about that. But we played at least 6 days a week, if not 7 days a week. I'm on the left, if you couldn't tell, playing Requinto Jarocho. The man next to me is Daniel Cabrera, who is like a legend in 20th century Jarocho music. Improvisador. He was already 80 years old when I was playing with him. Tirso Velázquez next to him on harp. All rancheros. Tirso and his cousin Emilio Cordova lived in Paso de Toro, which is a short drive out of town, and that's Isidro Gutierrez. Tirso had a brother named Rufino, who was on the short side of and had a one of those sort of, I don't know how to describe it, sort of a Hitler type mustaches, and he was his name was La Mapacha, the raccoon. That was his nickname. And I remember Rufino said, I had a car, right? So that was big. He says, Daniel, quiero que me hagas un favor. He hardly ever said anything to me, so I said, oh, wow, this is big. I said, claro, Rufino, what do you want? He wanted me to do him a favor. And I said, sure, man, whatever you want. He says, I want you to go real early with me in the morning and pick up my son and take him to where the bus goes by on the highway. And I said, claro que sí, me dice la hora y ahí estoy. And so I met him really early before the sun came up, and he gets in the car and we drive off to Paso del Toro from Boca del Rio, and he says, okay, arrímate a esa casa. He says, go up, get next to that house there. And I said, okay. And he says, párate, no te acerques tanto, don't get too close. He said, apaga las luces. I mean, this guy was always subdued, and I'm thinking, what is going on here? So I said, I turned off the lights of the car, and I'm just, espérame 5 minutos, espérame aquí. And so 5 minutes later, he comes running out, literally, with his son and this young woman by the hand, and they come out and they open the car doors and jump in, and they say, vámonos, rápido. And so I said, okay. By that time, I was going to do whatever he told me to do. He says, so I got on the highway and drove down the highway. And he says, okay, aquí, déjanos aquí pasa el bus. He says, leave us here. This is where the bus comes by. And I figured out pretty early on when I got on the highway, hightailing it out of there, that estaba robando a la muchacha, he was stealing his bride. And they were going off into El Monte, as they say, to consummate the marriage. And so at that point, all I could think was of shotguns and rifles and all kinds of things. Some irate future father-in-law. Anyway, this was sort of just part of the general life. This is real life. You know, people, rancheros who'd come to this town to. This is the key to my whole dissertation thing, was change. The change that was going out of meaning, a role of music from rural areas to the Lino Chavez, Andres Huesca urban version of the son jarocho. That is Daniel Cabrera's jarana. On the right there is an ancient jarana. The dissertation.
This experience in Veracruz did have a point. He was writing a dissertation, and Alex is going to summarize the highlights of that dissertation for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of reading it.
And also give you a break, right? So. Yeah, just to kind of give a little context for those of you who might not be familiar with this particular piece of scholarship. In 1979, Dan Sheehy published his well-known doctoral dissertation, The Son Jarocho History, Style, and Repertoire of a Changing Mexican Musical Tradition, for a terminal degree in the Department of Ethnomusicology at UCLA. This landmark scholarly work is an excellent example of a nuanced and sort of critical examination of this dyadic relationship between maintenance and innovation. That's always axial to the pragmatics of how any sort of tradition circulates. Sort of expressive practices over time. And one of the things that I found very important, at least when I was mining through that literature on son mexicano, is that, there's a big legacy of sort of scholarship on son mexicano, particularly after the Mexican Revolution. So the typology of son that gets sort of constructed. And, Dan's dissertation is sort of a far cry from those sort of surface, at least what I interpret as being sort of surface descriptions, or trait lists, Stephen Feld would say, of his precursors. This is to say that this study traces the sort of social history of the son jarocho Veracruz, Mexico, with attention to exactly what Dan describes now, right? These socioeconomic trends that are impacting its performance and transmission in the 1970s by that point, and before that, clearly. So again, writing in the long wake of one, the kind of legacy of Mexican folklore, and two, interestingly enough, in the kind of wake of folkloristics in the United States that had just recently begun considering questions of folk traditions in urban settings. Sort of Dan Sheehy's premise of a sort of what he calls a changing musical tradition sort of challenged the essentialism embedded in the former and illustrated the dynamic interplay between change and continuity within the context of son jarocho, which the latter was concerned with. So moving past sort of preservationist tendencies or those kinds of depictions, the dissertation sort of considers the tensive ways in which commercialization and urbanization in the mid-20th century were transforming the vital functions and meanings of son jarocho, making certain aspects obsolete or changing them, while at the same time creating a climate for the development of new functions, repertoires, meanings, and geographies of transmission. So to a degree, his perspective positions these changes as part of a broader history of son jarocho's transculturation, which we can trace to the dawn of the colonial period, specifically how African, European, and indigenous groups came together to create these hybrid sounds. Indeed, it's still widely cited by scholars, practitioners, and artists alike, scholars alike. And this influential study continues to inform how this tension is even presently playing itself out amidst the grassroots transnational practice of son jarocho among U.S. Latinas and Latinos in the United States, largely of Mexican descent, in places like California, Chicago, New York, Texas. This is to say that son jarocho's practice outside of Veracruz raises these same questions about authority, repertoire, the use of tradition in new social spaces. And I think following Sheehy's lead, a lot of people doing this work now around son jarocho, a host of young scholars, many of them who are also jarocho practitioners, sort of are exploring how an emergent crop of these transnational jaraneros, jarocho practitioners, are challenging, living out, and re-signifying the meaning of this, as again Dan says, this changing musical tradition on their own terms. And again, the way I understand it, it's sort of, this is part of that history of flux, right? And change, so much a part of the transformative history of son jarocho, but I would say also vernacular string musics in Mexico altogether, right? And I think that is one of the very important key aspects that is a very important intervention that this dissertation makes, and in a present tense, right, sort of context. And in some ways troubling those borders between, what is traditional, what isn't, right? Or how do we understand these different styles of son jarocho in ways that just give us a perspective on that dynamic, as opposed to kind of reinscribing borders between sort of practices and communities. So just to kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for that. That's very helpful. Figuring out what I did there. I was really interested in finding out what today, more recent years, I would say I follow the principle of just a starting point of explaining music or understanding music, is that music has absolutely no meaning whatsoever. Music has absolutely no inherent meaning whatsoever, just vibrations, that kind of thing, except for the meaning that people give it. And I can kind of take that and look back, and part of the reason I sort of thought that way, I mean, this is not entirely 100% true, actually, but there's all some sort of kinetic things and all that, but that's what I was really trying to figure out, is what did this meaning mean to people? And there are different communities of people that somehow took part in the son jarocho. And, I kind of got in from the music side and went into the story, and somebody else might come in from the story side and get into the music, but I really needed to find that out. I was so hungry to know. And Jose Gutierrez, Chayote in LA, was one person that helped me get into that. And I still didn't have enough time to do a lot of the rural work that I wanted to do to be able to strike a little more, a fuller and more stark comparison between the model of a very social music, primarily in the ranches, and an urban driven sound and style of music that rose in the 1930s with Andres Huesca, the harpist, who really played música ranchera more than son jarocho. And he was the guy who had a stand-up harp made to order based on the Jalisco style, West Mexican style harp, because it looked better, because you looked good in the movies, and and it was more appealing. It fit better in professional performance venues. And then Lino Chavez, who played with Andres in the Costeños, his group. And that developed into a highly skilled and transformed, in many ways, sound and substance and meaning, because this is like a whole session right here, but, and Alex everybody here has written about this sort of thing, actually, but the maybe late 20s into the 30s, when the radio was big. 1936 with the film Allá en el Rancho Grande, that was a major milestone in the creation of Mexican modern identity, and the golden age of cinema that followed that, and that all led to listening to son jarocho played a certain way, a certain length of time on the radio and recordings in the movies, looking a certain way and all that started later on, in some people's point of view, created a very damaging schism between the practice of the music and its relevance to community life and that relationship there. And they were right, in a way. And it was kind of interesting. I was just down in Jalapa at La Universidad Veracruzana. I was invited last week, actually. Last week, in a Veracruzan music conference to be the speaker on the son jarocho. Which, imagine going to some place and being the invited speaker to speak on their traditional music. That's so after, whatever. So I figured out a way to do it. Just stick with what you know, basically. And it was interesting because there was a rhythm here. I was looking at this transition from rural to urban at exactly the same time that this movement called the jaraneros or fandangueros was getting going in the very late 60s, which, to make a very complex thing simple, was recapturing the human resources and the social role of people in rural areas, particularly in Veracruz, and inviting them to be participants in this. So Gilberto Gutierrez and others, Cesar Castro, his brother Ramon Gutierrez, and the group Mono Blanco would go in and bring a tarima, a little dance platform, into little towns and things like that, and just show up and start a fandango, and then, privilege the older, more knowledgeable musicians and things like this. And there became this rhetorical schism between that activity that became really a movement by any definition of the term, the jaranero movement or fandanguero movement, and Los del Blanco, and the marisqueros who played in the seafood restaurants, which was, I thought, a little harsh and counterproductive ultimately. And that's sort of what I spoke on. But ironically, praising the jaranero movement's inclusion, because if it was anything, it was inclusive. You didn't have to do anything or know anything. You just show up, and that's where you know and learn and witness and be part of the ambiance. And it was really interesting for me because I talked about how the son was being planted in different parts of the United States, and it's, these social causes like, events right on both sides of the border in Tijuana where people can reach through the fence and touch each other and dance to each other's music and be close to each other, sort of a protest against the inhumanity of the border. And protests at Fort Benning in Georgia, and the Escuela de las Americas, where torture allegedly is taught there and all that. Anyway, but it was kind of like going back to the past because there was this very localized variation in the tradition, and here we have this new, through great inclusion by the jaranero movement, and at the same time, I give lots of credit to the more specialized musicians because they planted through the media, through the regime of President Miguel Alemán in the 1940s, they planted a stake in the Mexican national consciousness for the son jarocho. That's not going to go away. It's there. And if it weren't there, who knows what kind of traction the jaranero movement would have gotten later. In any case, I ended my talk by thanking Andres Huesca, thanking Leon Chavez, thanking President Miguel Alemán, thanking up to the Mono Blanco musicians and all this, because if you look at the bigger tent, there's a lot of positive there that you don't want to just toss out. There's a lot to build on. So the dissertation for me was I'm kind of interested now in going back and doing it. It was there was like a moment in time that was written, and now this other stuff has happened that builds on that, and hopefully someday I'll have a little time to explore that a little more fully. Is that the kind of thing I was supposed to say?
I wanted
to.
Okay. I did want to make a comment. When I was in graduate school, one of my areas was ethnomusicology, and I remember talking with Dr. Paredes and about the whole performance practice in the UCLA program, and I felt so proud that he told me, there was a lot of good work coming out of that university. He goes, but I always wondered why Dan Sheehy didn't publish his dissertation. He goes, it was very valuable scholarship. He goes, and it should have been out there. So I was so proud that Paredes had given you his stamp of approval, which meant a lot to me. I don't know why, but it did. But on that note, we wanted to ask you a little bit about why you chose public sector work instead of working in academia.
Well, first of all, thanks for saying that about Americo Paredes. You won't never meet a more beautiful human being filled with humanity, and you didn't even need big doses of him to be inspired by him. And actually, my dissertation was translated into Spanish and was ready to be published by the University of Veracruzana in Veracruz, and they had an election, changed government, and all of the projects of the previous governor were thrown out. So it's still sitting out there. It's at least in Spanish now, so people who read Spanish can do it. Public sector, I don't know. It's like, how could I not do it? Was the thing. That person on the right there, Bess Lomax Hawes, who went back to the Smithsonian and had me teach one of her classes at Cal State Northridge, and then hired me as a field worker. This is when I was still working as a musician, a lot. And I remember, I'd get off work sometimes, say at 1 a.m. or maybe a little earlier than that, and I'd go to downtown LA, because usually my jobs were on the eastern side of Los Angeles, and there was this taco stand down on Hill Street. I can't remember the name, but they had tacos, buche, tacos, whatever, any part of the animal. And I'd kind of hang there, and then I'd go meet some mariachi musicians around the corner in La Hacienda, and did a lot of field work in East Los Angeles. And so at one moment in time, I realized that I was being paid by the National Museum to hang around with some of the people I most like to hang around with in the world. And that meant like a corrido singer that would roam what was then Brooklyn Avenue, now Cesar Chavez Avenue in East Los Angeles, with this busty woman from Sinaloa who had this incredibly large voice. And he was a sort of mild-mannered guitar player, then composer of the songs about the border. Them going into a bar right nearby called the Nochislense, that was about a little longer, maybe from where that table starts to the wall there, and maybe 5 times as wide as this table, filled with clients and a 9-member brass and percussion band, Banda Sinaloense. And you talk about leaving an impression on someone. You walk into a place like that with the tubas and trombones and clarinet and bass drum and cymbals and things like that. I mean, this was like, it just dawned on me. I said, oh my God, some people, this is like their career. So how could you not do that? I mean, it was like a kid in a candy shop. And then I got exposed to as I said last night, I was kidnapped by folklorists, and starting in '73, and I never turned back. And Bess Lomax Haas later became my boss when I drove up from Veracruz up to Washington D.C. in 1978. And I still had doubts, actually. I had 3 options. I could be a co-owner of El Mariachi restaurant in Orange, California, with my friends. I had a 1-year contract possibility at UC Santa Cruz to teach, or I could go back and work with Bess, whom I loved and respected. And so, I'd never lived outside California, so I went back to Washington with the idea of being there 1 year or 2 years, and then I'd go back to my beloved California. That was in 1978. So I'm still trying.
We're still trying to
I
get
did.
him back.
Yeah, still waiting. Right. Sorry about that. And so I was at the National Endowment for the Arts for 22, 23 years, and got to do things like help people get grants to do the Mariachi Conference in San Antonio and Fresno, and California. Later, I met Hugo Chavez. I've been in Venezuela. Sorry, Hugo Morales. We have 4 recordings of in Venezuela here, so I have Hugo Chavez on the mind. Hugo Morales, who in a conversation said that they got the idea for the mariachi festival there. That was big in Fresno. I'm looking at Amy Kitchener over there, the spouse of Hugo. He said he got the idea from the NEA grant report of having given a grant in San Antonio for the annual conference there. So we got to support things that bring jarocho musicians and residents, and of course, with the whole gambit. I had a moment. I couldn't sleep one night. There was a congressional hearing the next day, and we'd done a lot of work, and I couldn't sleep, and so counting sheep didn't do it for me. So I was laying there like 2 in the morning. I said, okay, I'm going to count culture groups that I can remember working with. and about 175, I fell asleep. And I got up, my eyes popped open, 6 in the morning, and I said, oh my God, I'm going to write all that down. So I wrote all these things down. Then I brought it to work and handed it to Bess. I said, here's look at this. I finally got to sleep, and so she passed it on, and it was several days later. Actually, I was sitting in one of those hot, stuffy congressional hearing rooms. They were talking about the NEA budget, and our chair was talking, and 175 cultural groups, and my eyes popped open. That's how that stuff gets in those congressional records, by the way, little stories like that. So anyway, it was a great ride, and then the Republican Revolution happened in 1995, 95, sorry, and then 1996. We lost 47% of our staff. We lost control over our budget, which meant that we couldn't be proactive and really work assertively with communities to help them put together applications for grants. And it really changed the National Endowment for the Arts in a very profound way to this very day. And I'm sorry to say that it's getting worse in that regard. So anyway, then moved over to the Smithsonian.
Yeah, just wanted to mention sort of briefly in terms of your work. With the Smithsonian, particularly Folkways, just to, for people here, is that Denji's produced and co-produced over 30 albums, the majority through Smithsonian Folkways, garnering him 3 Grammys, 1 Latin Grammy, and 6 Grammy nominations, for which he's also authored accompanying scholarly notes, scholarly liner notes, and these recordings and notes have covered a wide range of largely indigenous and mestizo musical traditions throughout the world, but in Latin America, of course, the Caribbean and the United States. And in terms of Latin America, it's everything, folks, from Colombian vallenato to the joropo in Venezuela, from the Mount music of Puerto Rico to the bandoneon tradition in northern Uruguay, Texas-Mexican conjunto to huapango from the Huasteca, right? All these have sort of been part of the projects that are part of Smithsonian Folkways, and the kind of the list goes on. Yeah, and that's just the Tradiciones series, the Latino series.
Tradiciones series, yeah.
And Russell had a question, didn't
Oh, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Did you have a question for him? No, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, while you're thinking what that question might be or might have been, that album on the bottom left was the first album I produced. That was a series produced by Catherine King, who split a job with me at UCLA in the audio lab, and she moved on and was hired by ABC Records to do a world music series. That recording, Música of Chile, was recorded when I was there in a University of Chile, University of California exchange in 1973. Now, I don't know how many people here know what happened in 1973. I got there in July, and then on September 11th, Pinochet did his thing, and I was living in Santiago, the capital, in La Providencia, which is kind of near downtown, nice neighborhood and all this. But that was a really tough time. President Salvador Allende was elected. He was president. He was a socialist. A lot of people didn't like that. The owner of the bus companies locked up their buses to make the people suffer. By the time workers got near where I was, literally people were like sardines, probably more tightly packed than sardines in buses and hanging onto the back and all this kind of thing. And I'd walk to work because there's no other way to get there really. And on September 11th, I was walking to the Facultad de Ciencias Musicales, a music department in downtown, and I unconsciously heard these popping sounds, and then I realized that the cars are driving faster than they normally drive on the main thoroughfare there. And then I got down to the perimeter of what they call downtown, and they were all milicos, as they call them, military, and carabineros as the national police. And by that point, I could hear large caliber weapons being shot and all this. And then the carabineros were there just, everybody go back. And the cars are driving faster and faster. And I walked back to my apartment, and I have these haunting memories of ex-urban workers, obviously, blue-collar men, individuals, sometimes two, walking toward downtown with their little bags with them, presumably with a pistol or something. They were coming to downtown to defend their president, Allende, that they voted for. And then from the apartment, there was it was toque de queda, it was immediate curfew, everybody off the streets, and we could see from the window the Hawker Hunter jets shooting rockets at the presidential palace, La Moneda. And it was like 48 hours toque de queda, and all they had on TV was Pinochet and a couple generals opening Allende's refrigerator at home. They'd already killed him because he went down. He was shot in the presidential palace defending his presidency, and showing wads of dollar bills in the freezer. I mean, who knows if they were planted there or whatever. And then a machine gun on a plaque dedicated to him by Fidel Castro, mi hermano en la revolución, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all you saw, like a 15-minute loop for the next 2 days. And everybody was running to the panaderia to get food. Anyway, that was a real life lesson, talking about field experiences there. And this recording that came out, I believe it was the next year, was a timely recording in that regard, in that it was strategic, and that it brought another face of Chile to the public in the United States. And that's Violeta Ibarra, a woman I fell in love with at first sight in a little town between Santiago and Valparaiso. I think it was Quilpue, I think was the name of the town there. It was a variety of regional music. So we had to, before the golpe, we would go up into the Andes, for example, on a field trip, and had to take the Red Cross ambulance, just hitch a ride any way we could to get up there. And some great experiences in Chile making that as well. It was like 2 miles high, literally, with very thin atmosphere. And I had a great experience of, they had like 8 plates in the town, and they had rice and chicken. And so we were the guests, some Chilean field workers. At work, I had a communist on one side of me and at my desk, and a military Patria y Libertad party who taught in the military academy next to me. And so I was in a crossfire, literally at work. But anyway, we got up to the Andes, and this guy, indigenous guy, kind of comes up to me at a Nagra, and he said to my tape recorder, and he says, "Are you from the United States?" I said, yeah, I'm from the United States. He says, "I want you to know that there was a guy here from East Germany recording music." I said, "Oh, that's nice. And he said, "His recorder was bigger than yours." so expressing his political view there. Anyway, there's lots of stories.
The next one?
Yeah, we had a bunch of questions on that last slide, but we're gonna skip forward, because I think all right. One of the things that thinking about you working in DC and the work that you're doing, and especially thinking about all these stories that you're sharing right now, these life experiences that obviously influence you. We're thinking about being in Washington DC. Your work as an advocate. Not only for like traditional expressions or cultural expressions, but I think you've really played a huge role in giving voice to marginalized communities, aggrieved communities, and so kind of what's that been like? What has been the challenges? What have been the obstacles that you've faced in doing this work?
Both NEA and the Smithsonian?
Yeah.
Obstacles.
Or successes, or what,
Yeah.
What's that experience? And what kind of?
There have been many obstacles, and there have been many opportunities. I have to say, though, I've always felt I lived a totally privileged life. Who has money they can give away? Who has a record label that they can work with? Who has somebody like Bess Lomax Haas to work with? Who has a Smithsonian Folklife Festival to work with and be part of? And who has the opportunity to be in the position where people from all these backgrounds, from in different countries or even just in the United States alone, open their homes to you and welcome you and sit down and have something in common to talk about because you share a cultural, social, and sometimes very personal agenda. And I don't know, I feel so humbled, I feel so privileged, I feel so, I don't know, lucky, that I tend, even though there were some pretty serious obstacles along the way, the change at the NEA I mentioned was heartbreaking, and it was a real setback for our field in terms of being able to build a field in a proactive fashion. Smithsonian and Folkways, budget has and adapting to the circumstances has always been a challenge. I think it's just miraculous that Folkways that supported, almost everyone has supported their salaries and benefits and production costs by income. So I went from appropriated money, to earned revenues. So we have to bring in almost $3 million a year to pay our employees, to do our production costs and all that. That's both gratifying because you get that immediate payback of your efforts. People are buying CDs and all that, and it's also terrifying, frankly. Challenges, sometimes. I think of having worked in a bureaucracy. I'm sure universities are like this in a way too. It's almost like learning to play the piano. You have to get a kind of a feel for it. You get the skills. You understand how things work, and then you also know what the rules are, so that you know how to get around them. Frankly, we have this. We have a cultural policy team in the Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage, and I tell you, I just put it out there. I said, for the vast majority of my career, cultural policy has been my enemy because the whole folk and traditional thing was not written in. It was implied that it was not part of it. We had to fight for every single inch of ground that we made. Thank God we had Bess Lomax Haas as our leader there for all those years, because she had all these connections through her Lomax family, through the folk music world, through all those kinds of things, and she was like a powerhouse and a person of such great dignity that no one could deny her her authority. And so she made a big difference for her. But just dealing with the bureaucratic and definitional and policy obstacles was those are the big ones. So I don't want to get down into all the bad talk about the little things. But there are a lot of those too.
Well, I know we're running short on time, so I will just mention that Dan has published quite a bit, and so I'm just going to quickly run through the journals in which he's, in addition to the wonderful book on mariachi, which I personally use in my classes, he's had a lot of publications, so we're just going to go through this real quickly, and we want to get to the question and answer part of the program. So did we want to say anything on this one, Russell? Or should
She's
we
on the.
get-
she's
and
on-
we're on the family.
She's on that one up there.
Yeah.
This is Dan's family. Pardon, and I just at one point everybody was playing, everybody's dancing, everybody was singing, and this is one of the. I mean, you were influential to bringing the expressive culture and practice to a lot of different people, and here is just a photo of your family who also practiced. There's
yeah, sorry.
no, go ahead.
Is that an invitation to say something?
Yeah, I'm inviting you. Let's dance.
Yeah, I went to Washington, D.C., 1978, and I have to tell you, I really felt like I was in a foreign country. There was really a different ambiance there. The color line that W.B. Du Bois described was everywhere I turned, black and white. There was not much else there in those days, and I didn't feel very comfortable a lot of the time, frankly. And then about a month into it, I went to the Washington Folk Festival and discovered Mariachi de las Americas, this ragtag group of Bolivians and Puerto Rican and Tejano, bajo sexto player and guitarrón, and the embassy. And soon after that, we started mariachilosamigos.com, if you want to see our webpage. And they're still ongoing, struggling along. And then at one point, Laura, my wife, who's from Corpus Christi, loved mariachi music. She was big into folklorico. That's actually how we met. And that's our son David on the left, who it's tough to look at there because he died 5 years ago. And our son Danny on the right, who is now, he says proudly, works at USAID, and his two main contacts, he works in the administrator's office. He started at the top. Conflict analysis and resolution is his field. He says proudly, his main boss is the chief strategy officer for USAID, so he's hanging around with all the muckety mucks. And the other person he works with mainly is the United States federal government's highest ranking LGBT coordinator. And gender, sexual orientation, a number of special issues out of the administrator's office fit exactly into his field of what he studied in conflict analysis and resolution at George Mason University. So he's doing very well. He's still trying to keep a hand in the mariachi with our Mariachi Los Amigos. This was Mariachi Los Tigres. The four of us and our two claims to fame were playing at the LULAC conference in Corpus Christi. My wife's grandfather was Luis Wilmot was one of the founders of LULAC chapter number 1, 1929 in Corpus Christi. And our other claim to fame was playing for Janet Reno in the Department of Justice. We have a nice picture of us with Janet Reno there for a Cinco de Mayo event. So anyway, that's what memories those
Everybody over there, get on up. Everybody right there, get into it. Everybody right there, get involved. Everybody just come on now. Come on now. Come on.
So that is the Godfather of Soul telling us that it's time to turn it over to any questions in the audience.
Thank you.
Any questions from the...
I played Mother
Yes.
Popcorn at the conference down in Veracruz, actually.
Questions? Yes,
Mother
Amy.
Popcorn. Yeah.
Amy?
You're going to make me cry, Amy. We go back quite a way, actually. Well, for me, everything is very personal. I'm not particularly interested in things that are some abstract this or that. And so whenever I talk to people, I say, figure out what you really, really like, what really resonates with you. And don't build a career on something that you don't have that kind of feeling about. And take just that personal approach, really trying to liberate a person to be themselves. And I think this field, so many people. This is just perfect for so many people. This work we work in, and the life we lead. I don't know. I just try to let people feel free and point them in directions of things that might be helpful to them, that sort of thing. So But, it's really easy working with people like Amy here, So I recognized her right away because I felt I had a special connection to her because she's a worrier. And I was always a worrier. My stomach was always worrying about something. That's why I couldn't sleep and had to count cultures that night. I was always worrying about something, very uptight. And then I met her, and she was totally the same way as far as I could tell. And I said, "Oh yeah, she's gonna be good." So, so I don't know. I think it comes down. It really comes down to humanity. It doesn't come down to disciplines. It doesn't come down to any of these sort of constructs. It ultimately goes back to people. And so I think if people are people to one another, then that's the best way to go. I don't try to preload any foregone conclusions with people. So.
Other questions? Other questions? Yes, Amy? Another Amy?
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, good song. Yeah. Yeah, sure. I was really disappointed last night because my computer with a video of Casal jammed, and then I had a backup computer and it wasn't compatible with the machinery, and so I had my hard drive, but that didn't have that video on it. I don't. For me, I don't. Everything's fusion, really. I don't think of fusion that much. I think of ongoing creation, and Quetzal, for me, I mentioned sometime in this meeting, Roberto Martinez, who died, 2 years now, or a year and a half ago, from Albuquerque here, musician. He told me we became friends. We were on tour since like 1984 and worked together and all this, and he was an activist and all this, and Los Reyes de Albuquerque. He said, for me, tradition means that the community feels like they own it. And if the community doesn't own something, then how can that be traditional? How can that possibly be traditional? Because that was his understanding, and a lot of people's understanding of it. And then he went on to say, so society evolves, and if the music doesn't evolve with it in one way or another, it could evolve in meaning, or it could evolve in substance of music, in music. Then it's not traditional anymore. I found that very helpful to me. And in Folkways, I didn't have guidelines that said these are grants for folk and traditional things only and not other stuff. And so just that notion of community ownership, and Quetzal, who is extremely articulate, and that video is on our website if you wanted to hear his words. He basically said it right there, how he was playing rock, but he was playing traditional music, son jarocho particularly. And then that's how his group, Los Murciélagos, started. And from there, just playing traditional music. And he went off, though, adding this and adding that, because, and one of the most articulate expressions of this, Russell Rodriguez made at an AFS meeting a number of years ago. At one point, after doing Folklorico all those years, it dawned on him, and I'm saying this in front of him so he can correct me or embellish it here, that he wasn't Mexican. That he was being forced into some template of Mexican practice that ultimately wasn't the real him. He was Chicano. And this is basically what Quetzal has done with his music. He draws from R&B. That's in the environment. I use it in our mariachi. We used to play in the Latin American Press Club, every weekend. And what was the other music that we alternate sits with? You are the sunshine of my love, da, 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 And that was reality. That was the wellspring there. And so Quetzal was bold enough and creative enough and honest enough to incorporate these sounds of his environment to create something that fit very well for me in the concept of our recording series, which for me is bandera musical, a musical flag. When you hear that music, you say, ahí estoy yo, that's me. That music is in me, and I'm in that music. And that's basically what Quetzal did. So I see it really as a creative act of being in sync with the life that he is intending to represent there. Yeah, it's nice to get a Grammy Award too, because it's like holding up a big megaphone in front of what you do. So.
Okay, we're going to close now, and Russell and Alex wanted to deliver a message.
Well, this is very unrehearsed.
Very.
So we took, Alex and I took about a half hour yesterday, and we wrote you a mini corrido.
All right.
Un corrido en si bemol.
Si bemol, right. Una la bemol. La suspendido.
And we have no melody. We'll probably improvise a melody right now. We have no key. We have no guitar.
But they have voices.
We have no money.
And as you well know, some corridistas that that's what it was. You just sang it out. You didn't have your guitarras. You didn't have this, right?
But before we do that, one thing I just wanted to one comment is the idea that one of the things that Dan has always been clear about and is his is demonstrated his position where how you're positioned in all these different spaces, places. And that's been probably one of the biggest lessons that I've learned. But I think the other thing is just, to me, you're one of these incredible, knowledgeable men, persons that has, can easily take the authority on all these types of discourses and subjects. But you've always been incredibly gracious into recognizing who real authorities are. The idea that you'll send people, when they start asking you, can you come and talk at this event, or can you be, the keynote at this, and you should go talk to so-and-so first, when it's on mariachi music, when it's on jarocho music, when it's on these other, and I think that's been one of the biggest lessons, because we've seen a lot of other people easily take the authority, and I think that's, to me, I just want to thank you for really identifying, all these incredibly knowledgeable people that would not get the public forum in a lot of places. And so, anyways, this is I guess this is El Corrido de Danshiji. This is the first version. Yeah. So we have to add verses as we go along and we have to get about another 12 versions, melodic versions of it.
And then we'll come to the variant X. Yeah. And then we will have like the ideal Danshiji corrido. This is going to take a while. So this is the first one.
You have me really intrigued because I want to know what rhymes with shihi. Yeah. In Spanish.
I shouldn't even show the text because it's changed.
Yeah.
We keep changing, so.
No, because it's
evolving.
It's a draft. En 1900, quién sabe, se creó un valiente querido en Bakersfield, California, amigo de los amigos, amante del son mexicano, mariachero de corazón, requintero entre los jarochos, curador, más bien curandero de profesión.
Abraza destinos con fuerza y amor y uniendo caminos, Danshiji, Señor. Por eso se canta con gran resplendor, corrido en voz alta de un gran valedor.
Pam, pararararán. transitando por todo el mundo, haciendo sus grabaciones, andando entre pueblo y pueblo, apreciando las tradiciones, excuse me. Si quieres, excuse the pochismos too. Ya me voy nomás por ahorita, con el verso mexicano, lo esperamos en California, maestro, y nuestro amano.
Abraza destinos con fuerza y amor y uniendo caminos dan shiji, Señor. Por eso se canta con gran resplandor, corrido en voz alta de un gran valedor. Pam, pam.
Thank you, Dan Sheehy.